Welcome to Miss Retro Reads. We're continuing with 6 Years as a Texas Ranger by James B. Gillette. Chapter 3, I Joined the Texas Rangers. The fame of the Rangers had of course become common knowledge among all Texans. Their deeds of adventure and their open, attractive life along frontier appealed to me, and I had conceived the desire to enlist in the battalion. But the enlistment, as announced by Captain Roberts, would not be made until June 1st, 1875, and I reached Manderville early in March. I had intended going on to join Mr. Frank's outfit, but as I have already explained, I hired out to Mr. Ellis until I could enlist in Captain Roberts' company. About the middle of May, 1875, Joe Franks had worked back in Menard County. I wished to see my old friends in his outfit, and so went over to meet them. While there, I mentioned that I was going to join the Rangers. A cowboy named Norman Rogers, who was working for Mr. Franks, said he would also like to join, so we decided we would go over to Captain Roberts together and see if we couldn't get him to recruit us in his company. Rogers and I rode over to the Ranger camp beyond Manderville. Neither of us had ever been in such a camp before, nor did we know anyone in the company. Of the first ranger we met, we inquired where we could find the captain. His tent was pointed out to us, and we went toward it. "Jim," said Norman as we approached the tent, "you will have to do the talking." Captain Roberts met us as we came up and invited us to be seated. I told him at once that we came to enlist as Rangers. He asked us our names, where we were working, and finally inquired if we had anyone that would recommend us. We had not thought of references, but told him that probably Mr. Franks or Mr. Ellis would stand for us, as they were well-known and prominent cattlemen for whom we had worked. Captain Roberts looked straight at me and said, "You say your name was Gillette?" "Yes, Jim Gillette," I replied. He then asked me where I was born, and I told him Austin, Texas. "Are you a son of James S. Gillette, who was Adjutant General under Governor Sam Houston?" I told him I was. "I have often heard my father, Buck Roberts, speak of your father," he said in a friendly tone. Captain Roberts then asked us what kind of horses we had, telling us that a ranger was required to have a good mount, for each man was allowed to have only one horse, which had to be a good one, that could be ridden every day for a month if necessary. I told him I had 2 good pony mares. He burst out laughing and said a mare was not allowed in the service. He told us to go and see what kind of mounts we could get, and then come back and let him inspect the animals. He never once said he would accept us, but as the interview was now over, he had not refused us. We went back to camp, feeling very hopeful we would soon be Rangers. I secured a big black pony, and Norman a gray one, as large as mine, but a much prettier horse. We returned to the Ranger camp a few days later mounted on these ponies. The captain looked them over, said they're small, but that he would accept them, and told us to be at his camp by May 31st to be sworn into the service. We left camp that evening, all puffed up at the prospect of being Texas Rangers. The last day of May arrived. Norman Rogers and myself, with many other recruits we had never seen before, were all at the Rangers' camp. On June 1st, 1875, at 10 o'clock, we were formed in line, mounted, and the oath of allegiance to the state of Texas was read to us by Captain Roberts. When we had all signed this oath, we were pronounced Texas Rangers. This was probably the happiest day of my life, for in joining the Rangers, I had realized one of my greatest ambitions. Immediately after being sworn in, the men were divided into messes. 10 men to the mess, and issued 10 days' rations by the orderly sergeant. These consisted of flour, bacon, coffee, sugar, beans, rice, pepper, salt, and soda. No potato syrup or lard was furnished, and each man had to supply his own cooking utensils. To shorten our bread, we used bacon grease. Beef was sometimes supplied the men, but wild game was so plentiful that but little other meat was required. Furthermore, Each recruit was furnished a Sharps carbine, 50 caliber, and one .45 Colt pistol. These arms were charged to us, their cost to be deducted from our first pay. Our salary of $40 per month was paid in quarterly installments. The state also supplied provender for the horses. Though a ranger was forced to supply his own mount, the state undertook to pay for the animal. If it were killed or lost in an Indian fight, to establish impartiality, the value of our animals, Captain Roberts marched us into Manderville and asked 3 citizens of the town to place a value on each man's mount. This was done, and I was highly gratified when Old Coley, my mount, was appraised at $125. This formality over, the company was moved from Little Saline to Camp Las Moras, 5 miles southwest of Manderville, Texas. We were now ready to begin scouting for Indians. As is usual under similar circumstances, the new recruits came in for their share of pranks and mishaps. One raw rookie in my mess, fired with love of economy, undertook to cook 10 days' rations for the whole mess at one time. He put a quantity of rice on the fire. Soon it began to boil and swell, and that surprised ranger found his rice increasing to unheard of proportions, filled every cooking vessel in the mess with half-cooked rice, and still the kettle continued to overflow. In desperation, he finally began to pour it on the ground. Even then, he had enough rice cooked to supply the entire company. Another recruit, anxious to test his new weapons, obtained Captain Roberts' permission to go hunting. He had not gone far from camp when he began firing at some squirrels. One of his bullets struck the limb of a tree and whizzed close to the camp. This gave an old ranger an idea. He hastened after the hunter and gravely arrested him, declaring that the glancing bullet had struck a man in camp, and that Captain Roberts had ordered the careless hunter's arrest. The veteran brought in a pale and badly scared recruit. One of the favorite diversions of the old rangers was to make a newcomer believe that the state furnished the rangers with socks and start him off to the captain's tent to demand his share of free hosiery. The captain took these pranks in good part and assured the crestfallen applicant that the rangers were only playing a joke on him, while his tormentors enjoyed his discomfiture from a safe distance. When they had run out of jokes, the men settled down to the regular routine of camp. Each morning the orderly sergeant had roll call, at which time he always detailed 6 or 8 men with a non-commissioned officer to take charge of the rangers' horses and pack mules until relieved following morning by a new guard. The guard was mounted and armed and drove the loose stock out to graze. The horses were never taken far from camp for fear of being attacked by Indians, and also to keep them near at hand in case they were needed quickly. The rangers, not on guard, spent their time as they wished when not on duty. But no man could leave the camp without the captain's permission. The boys played such games as appealed to them, horseshoe pitching and cards being the favorite diversions. As long as it did not interfere with a man's duty as a ranger, Captain Roberts permitted pony racing, and some exciting contests took place between rival horse owners. Besides these diversions, hunting and fishing were always available, for the woods and streams were stocked with game and fish. I soon had cause to congratulate myself on my enlistment in Company D, for I found Captain D. W. Roberts the best of company commanders. At the time I joined his command, he was 35 years of age, very slender and perhaps a little over 6 feet tall. His beard and hair were dark auburn. He always dressed neatly and was kind and affable in manner, looking more like the dean of an Eastern college than the great captain he was. Captain Roberts was a fine horseman and a good shot in both pistol and rifle. He was also a fine violinist and often played for the boys. He had been raised on the frontier and had won such a reputation reputation as an Indian fighter that the state legislature presented him with a fine Winchester rifle for his gallantry in fighting the Indians. The captain had made a close study of the habits and actions of the Indians, and their life was an open book to him. This, of course, gave him a great advantage in following and fighting them, and under his able leadership, Company D became famous. There was not a man in the company who did not consider it a compliment to be detailed on a scout with Captain Roberts. In the later part of the summer of early fall of 1875, Captain Roberts visited Colorado County, Texas, and returned with a bride, a Miss Lou Conway. Mrs. Roberts was a refined and elegant lady, and soon adapted herself to the customs of the camp. She was with her husband on San Saba River during the winter of 1875 and 1876, and soon became as popular with the company as Captain Roberts himself. Most people would consider the life of the Texas Ranger hard and dangerous, but I never found it so. In the first place, the Ranger was always with a body of well-armed men, which was more than a match for any enemy that might be met. Then there was an element of danger about it that appealed to any red-blooded American. All of western Texas was a real frontier then, and for one who loved nature and God's own creation, it was a paradise on earth. The hills and valleys were teeming with deer and turkey. Thousands of buffalo and antelope were on the plain, and streams all over Texas were full of fish. Bear caves and bee trees abounded. In the springtime, we could travel for hundreds of miles on a bed of flowers. Oh, how I wish I had the power to describe the wonderful country as I saw it then. How happy I am now, in my old age, that I am a native Texan and saw the grand frontier before it was marred by the hand of man. The Lipan, Kickapoo, Comanche, and Kiowa Indians used to time their raids so as to reach the Texas settlements during the light of the moon, so they would have moonlight nights in which to steal horses and make their getaway before they could be discovered. By morning, when their thefts became known, they would have a long lead ahead and be well on their way into the plains and mountains. The captains of the ranger companies knew of this Indian habit and accordingly kept scouts constantly in field during the period of the raids. The Indians coming in from the plains where water was scarce generally took the near cut to the headwaters of the Colorado, Concho, San Saba, Llano, Guadalupe, and Nueces rivers. By maintaining scouts at or near the heads of these streams, the Rangers frequently caught parties of Indians going in or coming out from the settlements and destroyed them or recaptured the stolen stock. The first light moon in June, Captain Roberts ordered a detail of 15 men in command of Sergeant James B. Hawkins to make a 10-day scout towards the headwater of the North Llano River. He was to select a secluded spot near old Fort Tarrant and make camp there. Each morning, a scout of 1 or 2 men would be sent out 10 or 15 miles to the south, and another party a like distance towards the north to hunt for Indian trails. The main body of rangers, kept carefully concealed, was in readiness to take up an Indian trail at a moment's notice, should one be found by the scouts. One morning, Sergeant Hawkins ordered me to travel south from camp to head draws of South Llano and watch for pony tracks. "Suppose the Indians get me?" I asked laughingly, as I mounted my pony. "It's your business to keep a sharp lookout and not let them catch you," he replied. However, though I watched very carefully, I could find no pony tracks or Indian trails. We had with us on this scout Mike Lynch, an Irishman. Though he was old and gray-headed, he was a good ranger and had much native wit. One morning it was Uncle Mark's turn to go on scout duty, but in a few hours he was seen coming into camp with his horse, Possum, on the jump. He reported a fresh Indian trail about 10 miles north of our camp. When asked how many pony tracks he had seen, Lynch declared he had counted 17 and thought there were more, as the Indians usually came in on foot or with a few ponies as they could get along on until they could steal others, Sergeant Hawkins suspected the tracks Lynch had seen were those of mustangs. The excited scout declared vehemently that the tracks were not those of wild horses, but of Indians. The sergeant was just as positive that no Indian party was responsible for the trail, and the two had quite a heated argument over the tracks. "But how do you know it's an Indian trail?" demanded Hawkins. "Because I know," cried Lynch in a loud voice. That settled it. Horses were saddled and mules packed as quickly as possible, and the Rangers marched over to the suspicious trail. When Sergeant Hawkins examined it, he soon perceived that the sign had been made by mustangs, but he could not convince the hard-headed Irishman of this fact until he had followed the trail 2 or 3 miles and showed him the mustang herd quietly grazing under some shade trees. Uncle Mike did not mention Indian trails any more on that scout. Though we did not find any trails or Indians, the scouting party killed 2 black bears, several deer, and about 15 wild turkeys. Early in September 1875, Captain Roberts again ordered Sergeant Hawkins to take 15 men and make a 10-day scout on the Brady Mountains. To my great joy, I was detailed on this expedition. Then, near the head of Scalp Creek, Menard County, on our return trip, the sergeant told the boys to keep a sharp lookout for deer, as we would reach the San Saba by noon and would camp on the stream for the night. We had not traveled far before Ed Seeker killed a nice little spiked buck. We strapped him on one of the pack mules, and when we arrived at the river, we came upon a flock of half-grown wild turkeys. Bill Clement leaped from his horse and killed 6 of them. We then camped, hobbled, and sidelined our horses, and put a strong guard with them. While some of the boys were gathering wood for our fire, they found an old elm stump 10 or 12 feet high, with bees going in at the top. One of the rangers rode over to Rough Wind's ranch and borrowed an axe and a bucket. When he returned, we cut the tree and got more honey than 16 men could eat, besides filling the bucket with honey, which we gave to Mrs. Wynne in return for the use of her axe. Then after dinner, out came fishing tackle, and using venison for bait, we caught more catfish than the entire crowd could eat. Hunting conditions in those days were ideal. I have known a single scout to kill 3 or 4 bears on a single trip. The companies to the north of us were never out of buffalo meat in a season. Then in the fall, one could gather enough pecans, as fine as ever grew, in half a day to last the company a month. I have seen hundreds of bushels of nuts go to waste because there was no one to gather them. Besides, they sold on the market for 50 cents per bushel. No wonder that a boy who loved the woods and nature was charmed and fascinated with the life of a Texas Ranger. It was a picnic for him from start to finish, and the 6 years I was with the battalion were the happiest and most entertaining in my life. But hunting and fishing and vacation scouts were not the sole duties of a ranger. Pleasure was abundant, but there were times when all these things were laid aside. For the game, guns, and the fishing rod was exchanged, our carbines and our 6-shooters, and engaged in hazardous expeditions after marauding Indians. I was soon to experience this aspect of ranger life, for in the latter part of August 1875, I became a real ranger and entered upon the real work of our battalion, that of protecting the frontier against the roving Indians and engaging them in regular pitched battles. Chapter 4. My First Brush with the Indians. The latter part of August 1875, Private L.P. Seeker was sent on detached duty to Fort Mason, about 50 miles due east of our camp. While there, a runner came in from Honey Creek with the report that a band of 15 Indians had raided the John Gamble Ranch and stolen some horses within 25 steps of the ranch house. The Indians appeared on their raid late in the evening, and the runner reached Mason just at dark. Lim Seeker had just eaten his supper and was sitting in the lobby of the Frontier Hotel when the message came. He hurried to the livery stable, saddled his horse, Old Pete, and started on an all-night ride for the company. The nights of August are short, but Seeker rode into our camp about 8 o'clock the following morning and reported the presence of the Indians. The company horses were out under herd for the day, but Captain Roberts sent out hurried orders for them. Sergeant Plum Murray was ordered to detail 15 men, issue them 10 days' rations of 100 rounds of ammunition each. Second Sergeant Jim Hawkins, Private Paul Durham, Nick Donnelly, Tom Gillespie, Mike Lynch, Andy Wilson, Henry Maltmore, Jim Trout, William Kimbrough, Silas B. Crump, Ed Seeker, Jim Day, John Cups, and myself, under command of Captain Roberts, were selected as the personnel of the scout. As can be imagined, I was delighted with my good fortune in getting on the party and looking forward with intense satisfaction to my first brush with the Indians. The mules were soon packed, and by the time the horses reached camp, the scout was ready. Sergeant Hawkins, as soon as the men had saddled their horses, walked over to the captain, saluted, and told him the scout was ready. Before leaving camp, Captain Roberts called to Sergeant Murray and told him that he believed the Indians had about as many horses as they could well get away with, and that they would probably cross the San Saba River near the mouth of Scalp Creek and follow the high divide between the two streams on their westward march back into the plains. If the Indians did not travel that way, the captain thought they would go up the Big Saline, follow the divide between the North Llano and San Saba River westward and escape. But he was confident the band would travel up the divide north of Manderville. He determined to scout that way himself and instruct Murray to send 2 rangers south over to the headwaters of Bear Creek to keep a sharp lookout for the trail. These 2 scouts were to repeat their operation the next day, and if they discovered the Indian trail, Murray was to make up a second scout and follow the Indians vigorously. His plan outlined, Captain Roberts gave the order to mount, and we rode towards Manderville. Making inquiries about the Indians, all was quiet in this little frontier village. So we crossed to San Saba River just below the towns, and after passing the ruins of the Spanish fort, Captain Roberts halted his men and prepared to send out trailers. 2 of the best trailers in the command were ordered to proceed about 400 yards ahead of the party and keep a close watch for pony tracks while they traveled due north at a good saddle horse gait. The main body of men, under the captain himself, would follow directly behind the outposts. Our company had traveled about 8 or 9 miles when Captain Roberts' keen eyes discovered a lone pony standing with his head down straight ahead of us. He sighted the animal before the trailers did and remarked to us that there the trail was. The outpost halted when they saw the pony and waited for us to come up. Sure enough, here was the Indian trail, probably 20 yards wide. Captain Roberts dismounted and walked over the sign, scrutinizing every pony track, bunch of grass, and fallen leaf. He then examined the old pony. The animal was cut with a lance, with his back sore and his feet all worn out. It was then between 12 and 1 o'clock, and the captain thought the Indians had passed that way about sunrise, for the blood and sweat on the horse were now dry. The trail showed the raiders they're driving rather fast and were probably 35 or 40 miles ahead of us. The captain decided it would be a long chase and that we would have to walk them down if we caught them at all. There was no water on this divide, so we took the trail without stopping for dinner. Captain Roberts had a fine saddle horse, Old Rock, and we followed the trail at a steady gait of 5 or 6 miles an hour. At sundown, we reached the old government road that runs from Fort McCavitt to Fort Concho. We were then about 12 or 15 miles south of Kickapoo Springs, so we turned up the road, reaching the springs late at night. The horses had not had a drop of water since leaving the San Saba that morning, and facing a hot August sun all day. The men were pretty well tired out when they reached camp, had supper, and got to bed. We estimated we had ridden about 60 miles since leaving camp. During the day, Captain Robert's horse cast a shoe, so Tom Gillespie shod him by the firelight, as it was the captain's intention to resume the trail at daylight. The following morning, Captain Roberts took a southwest course from Kickapoo Springs and paralleled the Indian trail we had left the evening before. It was late in the day before we picked the trail up again, and many of the boys were afraid we had lost it altogether. But the captain laughed at their fears and never doubted that we should find it again. The Indians, as their trail showed, were now traveling over a tolerably rough country, which made our progress slow. About noon we found some rainwater and camped for dinner and gave the horses a short rest. When the boys went out to catch their mounts, we found that we had camped in a bed of rattlesnakes. 2 of our horses had been bitten. Jim Day's Chico had a head as big as a barrel, while the captain's horse, Old Rock, had been bitten on his front leg, just above the ankle, and it had swollen up to his body. Neither of the animals were able to walk. Jim Day could not be left alone in that Indian country, so Captain Roberts detailed Private Cups to stay with him until the horses died or were able to travel. In either case, they were then to return to camp. The animals soon recovered, and Day and Cups beat us back to camp. The pack loads were now doubled on one mule, so Captain Roberts could ride the other. Reduced to 13 men, we followed the Indians until night. It was a hard day on both men and beasts, so we camped where we found a little water in a draw that drained into the South Concho River. Considering the way we had come, the captain thought we had covered 60 miles during the day's ride. We had 2 rather old men on the Scout, Mike Lynch and Andy Wilson, and they were nearly all in. I awoke Andy at 2 o'clock to go on guard. The poor fellow was so stiff he could hardly stand, and I tried to get him to go back to bed, telling him I would stand his guard. But he was game, and in a few minutes limped out to the horses and relieved me. Early in the morning we were up and traveling. The mule Captain Roberts was riding did not step out as fast as Old Rock had done, and the boys had an easier time keeping up. We camped at noon on just enough rainwater to do us and took up the trail again after dinner. The trailer stopped suddenly, and as we rode up, Captain Roberts asked what was the matter. They said it seemed as though the Indians at this point had rounded up the horses and held them for some cause or other. The captain dismounted and swept the country with his field glasses. He circled round where the horses had been standing and found where a lone Indian had walked straight away from the animals. He followed the tracks to an old live oak tree that had been blown down. Then the reason for the stop became apparent. The Indians had sighted a herd of mustangs grazing just beyond this tree, and the Indian had slipped up on them and killed a big brown mare. Captain Roberts picked up the cartridge shell the brave had used and found it to be a 50 caliber buffalo gun. We also found the mustang from which the Indians had cut both sides of ribs and one hindquarter. Captain Roberts was much elated. "Boys," he said, with a smile, "we now have 95 chances out of 100 to catch those Indians. They will not carry this raw meat long before stopping to cook some. We have followed them now over 150 miles, and they have never stopped to build a fire. They are tired and hungry, and probably know where there's water not far away." He spoke with such confidence that I marveled at his knowledge of the Indian habits. We were now on the extreme western draw of South Concho River, far above the point at which the water breaks out into a running stream. Finally, the trail led out on that level and vast tract of country between the head of South Concho and the Pecos on the west. Here the Indians had turned a little north from the general direction they had been traveling, and all of a sudden we came to some rock holes filled with rainwater. Here the Indians had built 3 fires, cooked both sides of the mustang ribs, and picked them clean. From this high tableland, they could look back over their trail for 15 miles. The captain thought they had been there early in the morning, as the fires there were out and the ashes cold. We did not lose any time at this camp, but hurried on following the trail until late in the evening, when the trailers again halted. When we came up, we found that the trail, which had been going west for nearly 200 miles, had suddenly turned straight north. Captain Roberts seemed to be puzzled for a time and said he did not understand this move. About 1 mile north, there was a small grove of mesquite timber. This he examined through his glasses, seemed to me to examine each tree separately. The trail led straight into these trees, and he followed it. In the mesquite timber, we found the Indians had hacked some bushes partly down, bent them over, cut up the horse meat they had been carrying with them into tiny strips, strung it on the bushes, and building a fire beneath them, had barbecued their flesh. The Indians had made the prettiest scaffold for cooking meat I ever saw. We found plenty of fire here, and the captain was sure we would have an Indian fight on the morrow. From the trees, the trail swung west again. The Indians were traveling slowly now, as they evidently thought they were out of danger. Just before sundown, the scout halted, and we were ordered not to let any smoke go up, lest the band we were trailing should spot it and take alarm. As soon as we had cooked our supper, Captain Roberts had the fires carefully extinguished. It had been a good season on the tablelands, and there were many ponds filled with water, some of them 100 yards wide. We camped on the edge of one of these big holes, and where the Indians had waded into it, the water was still muddy. The boys were cautioned not to strike a match that night, as we were certain the Indians were not far ahead of us. We had covered between 40 and 50 miles that day. Camp was called at daybreak. We dared not build a fire, so we had no breakfast. We saddled our horses and again took the trail. Old Jenny, the pack mule, was packed for the last time on earth, for she was killed in the fight that shortly followed. As soon as it was light enough to see a pony track, 2 of the boys traced it on foot and led their horses, the remainder of our party coming along slowly on horseback. By sunrise, we were all riding and following the trail rapidly, eager to sight the marauding thieves. We had traveled some 5 or 6 miles when Paul Durham called Captain Roberts' attention to a dark object ahead that looked as if it were moving. The captain brought his field glasses to bear on the object specified, and exclaimed it was the Indians. He ordered the boys to dismount at once, tighten their cinches, leave their coats and slickers, and make ready to fight. As we carried out this order, a distressing stillness came over the men. Captain Roberts and Sergeant Hawkins were the only ones of our party who had ever been in an Indian fight, and I suppose the hearts of all of us green, unseasoned warriors beat a little more rapidly than usual at the prospect of soon smelling powder. Captain Roberts called out to us in positive tones not to leave him until he told us to go, not to draw a gun or pistol until he ordered, declaring that he wanted no mistake made on the eve of battle. He ordered the pack mule caught and led until we went into the fight, when she was to be turned loose. The Indians were on an open prairie dotted here and there with small groves of mesquite timber. The captain thought our only chance was to ride double file straight at them in the hope that they would not look back and discover us. We moved forward briskly and got within 400 or 500 yards of the Indians before they sighted us. At once there was a terrible commotion. It was the custom of the Plains Indians, when they had stolen a lot of horses, for each to select from the number the best pony he could pick out, and tying a rope around its neck, let the pony drag it along the ground. In case of discovery, the brave would quickly leap from the pony they were riding, grab the rope of the fresh one, and mounting it bareback, escape from their pursuers. On catching sight of us, they performed this maneuver almost in the twinkling of an eye, and then, led by their old chief, they took positions on a little elevated ground some 200 yards beyond the loose horses. They stationed themselves about 15 or 20 feet apart, their battle line, when formed, being about 100 yards long. As each warrior took his station, he dismounted, stood behind his horse, and prepared to fire when given the signal. The captain, with a smile, turned to us and said, "Boys, they're going to fight us." See how beautifully the old chief forms his line of battle. From a little boy, I had longed to be a ranger and fight the Indians. At last I was up against the real thing, and with not so much an umbrella behind which to hide. I was nervous. I was awfully nervous. We were now within 100 steps of the Indians, and then came the order to dismount, shoot low, and kill as many horses as possible. The captain said as we came up that every time we got an Indian on foot in that country, we were sure to kill him. With the first shot, everybody, Indians and rangers, began firing and yelling. In a minute we had killed 2 horses, and 1 Indian was seen to be badly wounded. In another minute the Indians had mounted their horses and were fleeing in every direction. Captain Roberts now ordered us to mount and follow them. The roar of the guns greatly excited my pony, and he turned round and round. I lost a little time in mounting, but when I did get settled in the saddle, I saw an Indian running on foot. He carried a Winchester in his hand and waved to another Indian who was riding. The latter turned and took the one on foot up behind him. As they started away for a race, I thought to myself that no grass-fed pony on earth could carry 2 men and get away from me and old Coley. The Indians had a good animal, but I gradually closed on them. The Indian riding behind would point his gun back and fire at me, holding it in one hand. I retaliated by firing at him every time I could get a cartridge in my old Sharp's carbine. I looked back and saw Ed coming to my aid as fast as old Dixie would run. He waved encouragement to me. Finally, the old brave ceased shooting, and as I drew a little closer, he held out his gun at arm's length and let it drop, probably thinking I would stop to get it. I gave it but a passing glance as I galloped by. He then held out what looked to be a fine rawhide rope and dropped that, but I never took the bait. I just kept closing in on him. He now strung his bow and began using his arrows pretty freely. Finally, he saw I was going to catch him and turned quickly into a little grove of mesquite timber. I was considered a fairly good brush rider, and as we went in among the trees, I drew up within 20 steps of the brave, jumped from my mount, and made a sort of random shot at the horse, Indian and all. The big 50 caliber bullet struck the Indian pony just where his head coupled on his neck, passed through the head, and came out over the left ear. It killed the horse at once, which fell forward 20 feet. The old warrior hit the ground running, but I jumped on my horse and ran after him. As I passed the dead horse, I saw the front rider struggling to get from under it. To my surprise, I saw he was a white boy between 15 and 16 years old with long, bright red hair. By this time, Ed had arrived and was dismounting. The fugitive warrior now peeped from behind a tree, and I got a fine shot at his face, but overshot him 6 inches, cutting off a limb just over his head. He broke to run again, and as he came into view, Ed placed a bullet between his shoulders. He was dead in minutes. When Ed and I walked up to the dead Indian, we found he had also been shot in one ankle, and his bow had been partly shot in 2. In his quiver he had only 3 arrows left. We hurried back to the dead horse to help the white boy, but he had extricated himself and disappeared. We then returned to the dead warrior, but he had disappeared. We took his bow, shield, and a fine pair of moccasins. I also found a fine lance near where the horse fell, and I presume it was carried by the white boy. We found the Indian had no Winchester cartridges, and this was why he dropped the gun. He could not carry it and use his bow. We went back over the trail, but weren't able to find the gun the brave had dropped as a bait. By noon that day, the boys had all returned to where the fight had begun, and the Indian horses had been left. Jim Hawkins and Paul Durham captured a Mexican boy about 15 years old. He looked like an Indian, had long plaited hair down his back, was bareheaded, and wore moccasins and breechcloth. Had he been in front of me, I would surely have killed him for an Indian. Captain Roberts spoke Spanish fluently, and from this boy he learned that the Indians were Apaches. He was taken back to our camp, and finally his uncle came and took him home. He had been captured while herding oxen near the old Fort Clark, Texas, and an elder brother who was with him at the time had been killed. The boys were then sent back to Captain Roberts to find the white lad who had been with the Indian Ed had killed. Though we searched carefully, we could find no trace of the mysterious youngster. 49 years later, I met this boy, now an old man, at a reunion of the Old-Time Trail Drivers Association in San Antonio, and learned that his name was F. H. Lehman. He had been captured by the Indians in Mason County some years before our encounter, and had now become one of them. He had hidden in the grass while the Rangers were hunting him, and after they had gave up the search and disappeared, he had followed on the trail of the Indians until he rejoined them. When the Rangers had all gathered after the fight, our pack mule, Jenny, was missing. We supposed that in the run she had followed the Indians off. 6 months later, Ed was detailed to pilot a body of United States soldiers over that same country to pick out a road to the Pecos River. He visited our old battlefield and found Jenny's carcass. She had a bullet hole in the center of her forehead. The Indians, in shooting back at their attackers, probably hit her with a chance shot. The pack saddle was still strapped to her body, but wolves had eaten all the supplies. 500 rounds of ammunition was still with her, showing that no one had seen her since the day of her death. Lacking Jenny's supplies, we had nothing to eat except the barbecued horse meat we had captured from the Indians. This had no salt on it, and I could not swallow it. In the fight, we killed 3 horses and 1 Indian and captured the Mexican lad. At least 2 Indians were badly wounded, and as victors we captured 58 head of horses and mules, several Indian saddles and bridles, and many native trinkets. Not a man or a horse of our party was hurt, the pack mule being our only fatality. Captain Roberts said that, but for the inability of our hard-ridden horses to overtake the fresh mounts of the Indians, not a soul of them would have escaped us. We turned our faces homeward, hungry and tired, but highly elated over our success. The second day after the fight, we reached Wash DeLong's ranch on the headwaters of the South Concho River. Mr. DeLong, a fine frontiersman, killed a beef for us and furnished us with flour and coffee without cost. 3 days later, we were back at our camp at Las Moras. The stolen animals were returned to their owners, and thus ended my first campaign against the Indians. And we'll continue this book next Wednesday. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for listening to Mr. Etcher Reads.